So is the traditional view of gospel authorship doubtful? I responded briefly to an interview that Ehrman did for the Genetically Modified Skeptic, and had some interesting comments to that video, which I think reveal, one, I didn't do a very good job of making sure people understood some of the background to what I was saying, but also that people maybe don't understand the background to a lot of these issues. So I'd like to, in this video, sort of expand on the larger issues behind my responses to that question of should the traditional authorship of the gospel be considered doubtful, as Ehrman asserts regularly. Now, I'm a classicist by training, but thankfully I was in departments where we also had rabbis teaching Hebrew, we had critical scholars teaching New Testament, and so on. I'm really grateful for those professors, Dr. Selyu in particular, the University of Minnesota, just really grateful for what I learned from Dr. Selyu about the biblical world, even though I was mainly in classics. So anyway, that's my background. I've been teaching classics. I teach in university and have been, of course, reading Greek for 30 plus years. A lot of skeptics tend to only listen to, Ehrman or a couple critical scholars, and then they sort of just assume that whatever they heard is really uncontestable. I think Ehrman, does a really good job in his text critical work, and his edition of the Apostolic Fathers in the Loeb series is amazing. And so there's a lot of things that are great about what Ehrman does. So I'm going to include his answer to this question about traditional authorship later in this video, and then I'm going to critique very specifically everything he says, and just know that I think Ehrman is a great scholar, and I'm not even pretending to be an equal of Ehrman in the biblical world, but it doesn't mean I can't evaluate his arguments and provide the evidence for why I think I disagree on some things, not everything. And you can judge for yourself. You can go track down the sources and stuff and see what you think. The tendency within early Christianity was to treat the canon as a narrow phenomenon. It was the books that were accepted early on was a smaller number than the number of books we have in our New Testaments. And then, of course, the attitude toward pseudepigraphs, the ones that are forged, as far as we know, is a little bit mixed. I mean, for sure, we have the example of in the days of Tertullian, so that's around 200 A.D. Tertullian describes the story of a Christian leader who fakes a writing of the Apostle Paul. He offers something that's as if it's from the Apostle Paul, and he's disciplined. If you read like Irenaeus and stuff, and all the concerns about heresies, some of the fake writings that were put out with heterodoxy, and so there's a lot of scrutiny of authorship, and so that's just to kind of set the stage there. The critical scholars, of course, many of them, not all of them, but many of them will dispute books which, back in the descriptions of the earliest canon, even books which were not disputed, right? So Eusebius tells us in the early 300s he sort of lists out books that were not disputed, and then he lists out books that were disputed, and then books that were just completely rejected. And the books that were not disputed, like the four Gospels, Acts, Paul's letters, things like this, the 1 John, 1 Peter, of course, many of those books have come to be disputed in the modern world of critical scholarship, like the pastoral letters and so on. And sometimes I think it's reasonable to, of course, evaluate the evidence for all of these books, but some of them deserve more scrutiny than others. But scholars reject Luke, as the author of the Gospel and of his Gospel and of Acts, and I think some of this, to me, just to be honest, seems a little conspiratorial rather than just a sort of healthy skepticism. Now, Ehrman has popularized the argument from what I'll call the argument from low literacy rates. Okay, others have had it, but he has popularized it because he mentions it a lot in his interviews. He's hardly alone in holding this view. And what this means is that literacy rates were so low, in fact, as low as maybe 1% of the population could write a book like these Gospels. Maybe, I think Ehrman says less than 1% in the interview we're going to look at in a little while here. And so, therefore, it's just simply, very doubtful that these Galilean fishermen could have written these books. And even to support that, Ehrman quotes from the book of Acts in chapter 4, verse 13, which we'll look at later. He quotes where it actually says that John and Peter are, well, what does it say? Well, it says that they're illiterate, that they literally don't even know their letters. So we'll take a look at that, what exactly that means later on. So I'm going to address some of the Ehrman stuff in the second half of the video. Okay, and I'll look at the argument from literacy and why I think that in the end is a weak argument of sort of refutation of the traditional view. But in the first half, I just want to lay out what the traditional view is. Now, the traditional view of gospel authorship is not doctrine. If Mark didn't write the Gospel of Mark, his name doesn't appear in the text anywhere, so it's not as though the title necessarily is viewed by Christians as inspired. Okay, but at the same time, I don't think it's true to say that this is just tradition in a kind of bland way. It's just what happened to come down to us. I think it's probably somewhere between doctrine and tradition. It's what you might call revered tradition. Okay, so you will sort of step on the toes of Christians for sure if you say, that Mark didn't write Mark. But if Christians were to stop and look at their own doctrines across history, you would see that, the authorship is not necessarily a doctrine. And of course, we don't know who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Some thought Paul, some thought Barnabas. Some nowadays, even Christians, will advocate for Apollos. We don't know who wrote that letter, and that doesn't seem to create any massive controversy that we don't know who the author is. Now, the methodology for determining authorship is pretty much universally used. You're going to look at the external evidence. What evidence do we have outside of the book itself, whether it's in citations from other authors, later authors, whether it's the manuscript copies, the titles of the manuscripts, things like this. And then you're going to look at the internal evidence, the evidence of the book itself. What is actually in the text? What in the book, in terms of its language, its history, its theology, does it match what we would expect so far as we understand who the author is based on the external evidence, okay? So that's how we would look at something like a gospel. And of course, even if there was a name in the text, you would still be asking, does the external evidence support this name? And does the content internal to the book match the kind of thing you might expect from this author? So it's external evidence on one hand, and it's internal evidence on the other. And just to give you a simple example from the classical world, from my world, there's a work which is largely regarded as the most accurate account of the campaigns of Alexander the Great, called the Anabasis of Alexander. And it's written by Arrian, Flavius Arrianus, or Xenophon as one of his other names. Arrian lived in the middle of the 2nd century AD, and he's writing, a few hundred years after Alexander the Great. So we have a handful of manuscripts which are titled and attribute this work to Arrian, but those are from, 1,000 years later. They're from the High Middle Ages. And then we have a small description of the biography of Arrian and of his works written by Photius. That dates to the 9th century AD. So that's from the 800s, which is, again, 600 years after the actual life of Arrian. His name doesn't appear in the Anabasis, so we don't have his name in the actual text. Now, if you go to scholarship in general in the classical world, there is no major controversy about Arrian's authorship of the Anabasis. And I'm just trying to set the stage for what it's like to be in the classical world. There's not a ton of ink, spent on this. The evidence is strong enough. There's no reason to have any serious doubts about it. Now, as far as the internal evidence of the 4 Gospels, that's really just a separate video. So I don't really have time to get into all of the internal evidence. You can look at commentaries in the International Critical Commentary series or something like that, and you can get a flavor for that, like Dale Allison's a commentary, lengthy commentary, voluminous commentary on Matthew. And you can sort of read the introduction. You can sort of see how someone would approach the internal evidence more systematically. So let's just start then with the traditional view of Mark and Luke. Christians have never claimed that the Gospels of Mark or of Luke were written by disciples, by people who were eyewitnesses to the content that they're conveying. All right. Now, the first evidence we have externally, the earliest evidence, is from Papias. Papias was born probably around the middle of the 1st century A.D. and lived into the first quarter of the 2nd century A.D., right? So roughly 50 to 125-ish. And these are just rough dates. We don't know his exact dates, but he is called by Irenaeus an near archeos, an ancient man. But that expression often means someone who was from the beginning, who was one of the originals, is frequently what archeos means. In other contexts, you can check me on that. Just look up in the one of the formal Greek lexicons, like the patristic lexicon, Lampe's patristic lexicon, if you want. If you compare him to Jesus and the disciples, right? Jesus is born before 0, actually, and his disciples probably born roughly between 0 and 10 A.D. Again, these are just ballpark. There's nothing really major. I'm not basing anything huge on this. And Jesus is executed in around 30 A.D., and then his disciples live on. Some of them are executed early. Some of them live on into the 60s and 70s and even into the latter quarter of the 1st century. And they wrote their books, the New Testament letters, probably written in, roughly 50 to 75 AD. The Gospel of Mark, probably during that time as well. Maybe Luke, who knows. Matthew also. And then, of course, the Gospel of John at the end. So you can see Papias's life. The point is his life overlaps. Even if you give a decade or so later, his life is overlapping with the time frame when these books are being written, and he is growing up. He's young. And then he writes an account, what's called an exposition of the sayings of the Lord, or the logia of the Lord, and that was written in somewhere between 100 and 110 if you follow Eusebius's Chronicon, his timeline. Okay, so that's where Papias is. Now, we don't have this writing of Papias, these 5 volumes. We only have a selection of some of the quotations from Papias, and those selections come later. There's some reference to things Papias wrote in Irenaeus in the latter part of the 2nd century here, in the late 100s. You can see when Irenaeus wrote around 170 to 200. 170s is when we get a reference to Papias. And then, of course, Eusebius later. Eusebius is in the early 300s. He's off this timeline. But he actually gives us the citations that we're going to be looking at of Papias. I don't know anybody who seriously doubts that. Ehrman certainly doesn't, I don't think, that Eusebius is giving us real quotations from Papias. And, of course, Irenaeus, just to put him in perspective, Irenaeus grew up in the church of Smyrna, where Polycarp lived. So Irenaeus, in the middle of the 2nd century, he's young, growing up, and he's in the church with Polycarp. And he tells us in his letter to Florinus that he remembers hearing Polycarp talk about his time with the Apostle John and things that he conveyed that the Apostle John said. And of course, Irenaeus is writing to Florinus. Florinus is a friend of his from his youth. They were in the church of Smyrna together, so this is a shared memory, so it doesn't seem to me the kind of thing that would be a fake. Of course, Irenaeus refers to Polycarp knowing the Apostle John in Irenaeus' own writings, what's called the against the heresies. So you have one writing by Irenaeus, okay, the against the heresies, which is including references to Polycarp and how Polycarp was a follower of John the Apostle. And then you also get the letter to Florinus and Eusebius, which again is sharing some of this as well. So all that just to say, Irenaeus knew Polycarp personally, and Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. You can see Polycarp was born around 75 AD and died in the middle of the 2nd century AD, so he overlapped with John the Apostle, who died, according to Eusebius, died in the early part of the reign of Trajan, which is 98 AD. Polycarp, we're told by Irenaeus, was a companion of Papias, and Papias was a hearer of John the Apostle. But Papias is actually earlier, is older. He's a near archeos, right? Irenaeus doesn't say this about Polycarp. He doesn't say he's in a near archeos, but he does say that about Papias. The best reference for Papias that's now on offer is called Papias of Hierapolis, Exposition of Dominical Oracles. So this is in the Oxford Early Christian Text Series. It's done by Stephen Carlson, that provides lots of analysis of the text and what is the actual text of Papias. So excellent work. I highly recommend it. Stephen Carlson, I've gone back and forth with him some on email, or continue to go back and forth with him on email about how to understand certain things in Papias. He's very helpful. And of course, he's been a guest blogger for Ehrman. He has a little different view of how to understand the term oracles, the logia, the sayings. Different meaning not different from other scholars. He shares the view of other scholars who understand logia to refer to the Old Testament, because it frequently does. In fact, he points out that every time Eusebius uses the term oracles, it's referring to the Old Testament scriptures. And so that's probably what Papias is understood to mean, or Eusebius would have told us. I take a view that other scholars take, which is the way Polycarp used the term logia in his letter to the Philippians, which again was written around the same time as Papias' writings, and he uses ta logia tu Kyriou, the sayings of the Lord, with reference to the actual sayings of Jesus. And I think as you look at what Papias actually writes, to me it suggests more that Papias is understanding the term logia to refer to the sayings and so on of Jesus, and not rather Old Testament scriptures which attest to the Messiah. That's how Stephen Carlson understands it. Old Testament scriptures which are sort of attesting to Messiah and therefore to Jesus. So what do we learn from Papias? Well, Papias says this, that's Eusebius. I should all highlight that. Through these things, Papias conveys the tradition about Mark, who wrote the gospel. So Eusebius is telling you that what he's about to share with you from Papias are comments about Mark and his gospel. Okay? Now, what is the citation? It's as follows. The elder John used to say. Now, this elder John is not John the Apostle, John the son of Zebedee. We won't go into it. There's a quotation where Papias makes it clear that there's John the Apostle, and then there's this other person, John the Elder. Now, John the Elder was an original disciple of Jesus. He actually followed Jesus in his earthly ministry. He was a mathitis tu Kyriou, as he says, a original disciple of the Lord, just like the apostles. And he was living in Ephesus when Papias was still younger, probably in his 20s or 30s, maybe into his 40s, who knows. And so he got to hear from the testimonies of John the Elder in the latter quarter of the first century. And he says, the elder John used to say, after Mark had become Peter's interpreter, he wrote accurately whatever he remembered of the Lord's sayings and deeds, but not in order. For he had neither heard nor followed the Lord. But later, as I said, because he's already talked about him, but we don't have that selection, he followed Peter, who adapted the teachings, meaning the teachings of Jesus, according to the needs, but didn't present an ordered account of the Lord's logia, his sayings. So again, it looks to me like the elder here, when he describes what Mark wrote, he describes it as the Lord's sayings and deeds. So that seems to be referring to Mark's gospel. But he didn't do it in order, meaning the order is not as clear in the classical tradition, which is sort of the impression left on most people who read Mark, is that it's less orderly particularly than, say, the Gospel of John. So all this is to say, you have this elder John, who was an original disciple of Jesus, in the latter quarter of the first century, is saying to people that the Gospel of Mark, which was written 20 to 30 years earlier, 25 years earlier than this, that gospel was written by Mark, who had been Peter's interpreter, his translator, probably. Some think it might mean something like an expounder, but it seems to me it more likely means translator. It's not crucial to what we're doing. So he was obviously a companion, a helper, whatever, of Peter, and so he ends up writing the gospel. Was it while Peter was alive? Was it shortly after Peter died? We don't know for certain, because the elder doesn't say that specifically here. Okay, so again, this evidence, this is written in, following Eusebius's Chronicon. This is written maybe 30 to 40 years after Mark wrote the gospel, but the testimony of John the Elder, of course, is from earlier. It's not like he just got it right then, because John the Elder is almost certainly dead by the time he's writing. But he does indicate that John the Elder was still alive, because he refers to him in the present tense when he's collecting this information, which let's just say let's put it as late as the 90s AD. It might have been earlier, of course. I'm just going to say, let's just say it's the 90s AD, and then he writes shortly after the turn of the century, in the early 100s. My point is, this is very early information. I mean, there's obviously, these are living witnesses to the background to Mark's gospel. Now, who is Mark? Well, John Mark almost certainly is the John Mark mentioned in Acts, whose family had a house in Jerusalem, and the apostles definitely spent some time there, as we learn earlier in the book of Acts. He's mentioned in Colossians, in 1 Timothy, in Philemon, as a companion of Paul. We know he went on Paul's first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas, didn't go with Paul on his second missionary journey, but instead traveled with Barnabas. Barnabas was his cousin, and since Barnabas was a priest, then John Mark probably coming from a priestly family in Jerusalem, which means there's a very good chance he was schooled being in Jerusalem. He was educated. Priests were commonly able to write, and so it's not surprising that he had some writing ability, although for sure the writing ability of Mark is not that great. The Greek would not impress someone who's read a bunch of classical literature like myself, or read something like Josephus or Eusebius for that matter. Now, the external evidence, all the manuscripts we have, some of which are very early, within a few hundred years of when it was written, are clearly titled to Mark, and we don't have any manuscripts that titled the gospel to somebody else or leave it anonymous. So that's all the manuscripts attributed to Mark. And then, of course, there's a handful of second century fathers like Irenaeus, Clement, Papias, we just mentioned. The Muratorian fragment has just a little clip of a description of what almost everyone interprets as Mark's gospel. And of course, Justin Martyr makes a reference to the fact that we have the memoirs of the apostles and of their companions, which most scholars take, I think, as a reference to the gospels, the memoirs of the apostles and of their companions. So not just are these gospels from the apostles, but they're also from some of their companions, and Mark, of course, would fit that. And Justin Martyr, it just so happens, he includes a reference of some content that is found only in Mark's gospel. And of course, Justin Martyr, his writings are from the middle of the 2nd century. So the point is, all this external evidence is really early, is way earlier than anything we have for something like Arian's Anabasis. We know the first solid reference is 800 years later. Just to close again, there's no evidence of anonymity. Okay, that's one of the key things. There's no Gospel of Mark without Mark's name attached to it, or a different name attached to it. Okay, so let's turn to Luke, and thankfully Luke has provided his own information for the reader. This is very common that an ancient historian or biographer would give some information, either to identify themselves or the nature of their work or the purpose of their work. They would do this either at the beginning or the end of a book, and this is what Luke does. Since many have undertaken to compile an account of the things fulfilled among us, just as they delivered them to us from the beginning, who were observers and became ministers of the word, it seemed good also to me, having investigated from the beginning all things accurately, to write in an orderly way to you, most excellent Theophilus, in order that you might come to learn the reliability of the account you were taught. All right, so it's my translation, by the way. So the first thing to notice is that he says that there were other accounts already drawn up, already published. There were accounts. Whether he's referring to the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and other writings, probably, right? Or maybe he knows Matthew, maybe he doesn't. But all that is to say, he knows of other writings. He certainly knows of Mark. But he says that since others have provided an account, and they gave their account just as it was delivered to us from the people who were the original observers of Jesus and eventually became teachers of his word, meaning the apostles and the original disciples. So notice that Luke is not criticizing these earlier accounts. He's saying that they received these accounts from the original observers, because the people who were writing up these accounts weren't themselves the original observers, some of them, some of the accounts, and so they were offering this information. But Luke is decided that since he went and investigated everything very carefully from the beginning, he's in a good position to write for Theophilus, who's obviously a VIP, to write to Theophilus in an orderly way, which almost certainly is a way of saying, I think, in a way that is more according to the standards of what a VIP like Theophilus would expect from an ancient biography. Because if, say, all you had was Mark, or maybe Q was circulating around, the famous Q, they weren't as up to standard to what a classical piece of literature would be. And Luke begins his gospel more in the form of the way a classical piece would work, and then provides a very nice orderly account of the ministry of Jesus. And of course, this would simply add to the credibility and the reliability of what Theophilus has already been taught. Now, of course, Luke doesn't mention his name, but then it's obvious that he is known. He has to be known to Theophilus because he's writing to Theophilus as if he's a personal, whether he's the patron or he's offering this book to him. So obviously the author is known to Theophilus. That is to say that it's not really, like, if you want to say the Gospel of Luke is anonymous, that's fine if you mean by anonymous only that it doesn't have the name of the author written into it. But that's different from saying it's anonymous in the sense that its authorship is suppressed or hidden. And he blatantly says, expressly says, he was not himself an eyewitness. Right? He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. So this is now the second gospel, Mark, now Luke, where the writer says that there were the original observers of Jesus who passed on the accounts of what Jesus said and did. And they, of course, have taught the word. They became ministers of the word. And Luke is writing now decades later, having done his own investigation of the content. But it's part of, in other words, the traditional Christian view is not that Luke was an original observer or eyewitness of Jesus. Neither Mark nor Luke were. Papias says Mark wasn't. Luke tells us expressly in the beginning of his gospel he wasn't a direct witness. But he is writing up an account based on observer testimony. That's clear from the opening that it's the story he's investigated that has come from observers, authopte, meaning not quite eyewitnesses, but kind of like first observers, I guess, like first responders. Now, all the manuscripts we have of Luke, including very early ones, some from possibly late 2nd century AD, but certainly early 2nd century AD. So these are very early manuscripts. Guess what? All of our manuscripts that have any attestation are attributed to Luke, and so there aren't manuscripts where there's no author attached to it or a different author. It's always Luke. And of course, we have a handful of 2nd century fathers. Again, 2nd century, very early, Irenaeus. And then, of course, you have the Muratorian fragment. And then the question of who is Luke? Well, let's see. Luke was mentioned in Paul's letters, Colossians, 2 Timothy, Philemon. And of course, he is famously the author of Acts, in which also he does not include his name, but does include multiple references to his presence as a companion of Paul on his travels in various parts of the book of Acts. He includes himself with the first person plural, we, in the text, which was a common convention by people who were eyewitness giving their sort of part in the account they're writing. Thucydides does the same thing when he describes the history of the Peloponnesian War, in which he was a participant on occasion. So Luke is pretty well known. He was a doctor, of course. He was educated, so he had schooling, and there's no reason to doubt he could write. But actually, the writing of Luke's Gospel and of Acts is a pretty decent writing. Acts is better, for sure. Luke, the Gospel, is not as the quality is a little inferior. I think. Okay, so just in summary, this evidence is vastly superior to the evidence that we looked at when we discussed the Anabasis of Alexander by Arian, for which, again, there's pretty much no controversy about that, about his authorship. So we have much, much better evidence that Mark and Luke wrote the books attributed to them, in this case the Gospels, and of course Acts as well. And after all, they're not the kind of things you would even have a suspicion about anyway, since if Christians really wanted to add, sort of some force or weight to these gospel accounts, you wouldn't pick Mark and Luke, because you might as well just shoot for an apostle. But of course, in the biblical world, everything is controversial. Everything is scrutinized in ways that go way beyond what you do in other fields of study, like in classical studies. So we turn then to Matthew and John, and of course now it is different. We now have accounts of the gospel accounts which are attributed to original disciples. Eusebius records a statement from Papias about Matthew, and there's no question in the context of Eusebius that Eusebius is understanding Papias to refer to Matthew's gospel, or the content that is part or as a part of Matthew's gospel, however you want to read exactly Eusebius's comments, but it seems to me kind of obvious he's referring to Matthew's gospel as he understands it. He says, while Matthew gave an account of the Lord's loya, the Lord's sayings, in Hebrew, each person interpreted, or better, translated them as he was able. So Papias obviously is talking about the Greek Gospel of Matthew. There's translations, plural, because he says each person translated Matthew or interpreted Matthew. Again, assuming it's a translation, because he starts by telling us that Matthew wrote in Hebrew. He wrote the Lord's sayings in Hebrew. And then it got translated. Now, that could mean interpreted, but it seems to me it more likely means translated in the context, since he's just mentioned that it was originally in Hebrew. So Papias himself is thinking of the Greek texts. We have texts, says Papias, where people have tried to render Matthew's original Hebrew gospel into Greek. Okay, so that means that neither Eusebius nor Papias are claiming that Matthew actually wrote the Gospel of Matthew we have in Greek, but rather that Matthew wrote a gospel in Hebrew. And that what we have is from in Papias's time, there were a plurality of attempts to render that Hebrew gospel into Greek. But of course, Eusebius is understanding it as this is where the Gospel of Matthew comes from. All right, so that's the earliest view, and many other fathers reference this, that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew. So the gospel we have, the Greek Gospel of Matthew, the earliest fathers do not claim that Matthew actually wrote that in Greek, but rather what we have is a translation of an original Hebrew text. Now, Matthew, for sure, most scholars conclude, and certainly Dale Allison's critical commentary concludes, that Matthew was written for a Jewish audience, meaning whoever produced our Greek Gospel of Matthew, they knew Hebrew. You can see his reasons for that if you want in his introduction to his commentary. There's tons of scholars who've concluded this. I'm just referencing one. It's obvious that Matthew is not a literal translation. So meaning for people like me who can read Hebrew and Greek, you can see, like in the Maccabees or in some of the Old Testament books, where First Maccabees, where the translation is very literal from the Hebrew, and so you get some awkward Greek and a number of indicators that you have a Hebrew text behind it. But our Gospel of Matthew is clearly better Greek than Mark, and it doesn't leave the impression of being a very literal translation at all. But of course, that's not really a big deal. I mean, you can translate things in non-literal ways all the time. So there's no, just because it doesn't come off like a translation is not a good argument that it's not a translation. That's my point. What it is a good argument against is that by looking at the Greek alone, you could conclude it came from Hebrew. You can't, except for one trait. Randall Booth has written an article which is very interesting analysis, a recent article in the last few years on Matthew's use of a particular narrative expression, like a transitional expression in a narrative, which is in Greek, in Hebrew it's vayahi plus a finite verb. In Greek it's a yenato plus the finite verb. Normally Greek uses a yenato plus an infinitive, not a finite verb. So you don't have to know all that. You can just trust Randall Booth. He's the expert here. What this means is that in these transition statements in the Gospel of Matthew, you get examples where the Greek is actually presenting grammar, which is not natural Greek grammar at all. It represents Hebrew grammar behind it. There's a Hebrew text behind this Greek text. These narrative borders, of course, these narrative transitions are the borders of how Matthew structured his gospel. It's got 6 parts, and each of the parts transition with a very specific expression. This expression is only in Matthew. It's not in Mark, which most people think Matthew relies to some extent on Mark's gospel. But those border statements that we're talking about are not in Mark, nor are they in Luke. It's kind of interesting because Luke does use that quite a bit in his gospel, spread throughout his whole gospel, not for the transition statements that Matthew uses, but in other parts of his gospel. So Randall Booth concludes that Luke also has a Hebrew text, a Hebrew gospel behind his gospel as a source. Luke does not have this grammatical syntax, this expression, the yenato plus the finite verb. He does not use this at all in the book of Acts, because of course Acts is not dependent on early sources like the Gospels are, and so apparently Luke didn't use this expression then because he's not taking it from a Hebrew background. He's just writing up a Greek account. It's also probably why his Greek's a little better too. What Booth is showing is that the structure of the gospel, of the Greek Gospel of Matthew, is actually based on a Hebrew original. So this is evidence then that the Greek copy we have of Matthew is actually, in its entire architecture of the book, is based on a Hebrew original. Even the transition statements themselves, which are unique to Matthew, are actually literal translations of an original Hebrew expression, vayahi plus the finite verb. This is going into the weeds, of course, but the reason we're doing this is because a lot of people don't even know anything about the background of how scholars work on these things and try to come to conclusions. So I'm giving you some details to support what the early church fathers said, which was that Matthew wrote originally in Hebrew, and then what we have is a Greek translation, a Greek rendering of Matthew's Hebrew gospel. That's, again, these are the earliest Christians were saying this, okay? The earliest manuscripts, of course, of our Greek Matthew attribute the gospel to Matthew. There are no manuscripts that don't have the attribution to Matthew, and no manuscripts that attribute Matthew to someone else. The name Mattheos or Mattheos, however you want to say it, it's the same basic name in all the manuscript copies, including very, very early copies, some around 200 AD. And then, of course, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Apollinaris, these all affirm Matthew as the author, and these are 2nd century writers. Now Matthew, what do we know about Matthew? I mean, he was the tax collector, right? He actually is named in the Gospel of Matthew as one of the characters in the Gospel. In fact, it's the only Gospel where the character Matthew does appear as named as Matthew, because he's a tax collector and Jesus comes along and tells him to follow him, and Matthew gets up and follows him. All right, so all that, again, is just the hard evidence, external evidence, as well as some of the internal evidence I went into a little bit because we had an issue of translation. So I wanted to support that a little bit of why I think The early fathers and the early manuscripts, we have no reason to doubt them. Now we come to John. I did about an hour and a half video on the Gospel of John, and I critique Ehrman's views at length in that video, by the way, if you want to see what I think about Ehrman's views on the authorship of John. And of course, Ehrman just represents what are common critical views, I think. Not everyone's views, but common ones. And of course, there's some dispute, by the way, whether the John who's being referred to is John the Apostle or John the Elder. Richard Bauckham takes the view that it's John the Elder. Richard Bauckham is a Christian scholar from England, but he certainly thinks that John is the author, but he thinks it's a different John, John the Elder. And I wouldn't want to get into a huge argument about that. I think the earliest evidence seems pretty clear to me. It's pointed to John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle. But if you think maybe that might not be true, and you're persuaded by Bauckham that it's John the Elder, who was an original disciple of Jesus too, it's fine with me. I don't really have a strong. It wouldn't burst my bubble at all if it was John the Elder who was the one who actually wrote John's Gospel or wrote 2nd and 3rd John or 1st John or whatever. It's someone named John who was an original disciple, and he's the beloved disciple. And I think the best evidence is that it's John the Apostle, and I would cite Zelwick's paper on that if you want to look at that even more. The traditional view then is, again, not about how these books came to be, but what their source was. Okay, so exactly what was the writing process? Like, how did they actually produce these books and publish them? Well, we have virtually no information on this. We don't know if Luke used an amanuensis or John needed a scribe because he couldn't write. I mean, we just have no idea exactly how their content was actually put into writing. Okay, now some of them certainly probably could have just written, but it doesn't really matter to us because it was common in the ancient world to use scribes. It was common for scribes to be not just taking dictation, but also contributing it, depending on their connection to you. We know, like Tiro, sometimes just wrote letters for Cicero. Cicero signed off on them. Other times Cicero dictated them to his assistant Tiro. So there's a wide range of how these things could have been produced. The means by which they produced is not of any serious concern. Now, the proper question then, at the end of looking at all the external evidence, the proper question is this, okay? The external evidence for these traditional views is really quite strong. I think Simon Gathercole's argument on anonymity is probably the best sort of summary of why the fact that the names don't appear in the gospel is sort of irrelevant. You can look at that paper. But the real question to ask is, because the evidence is so strong externally, and there's nothing obvious internally, other than, again, Ehrman's point about literacy, we'll get to that. There's nothing obvious internally that would be a defeater of the overwhelming external evidence of who are the authors behind these Gospels. The question is, do we have sufficient reasons to seriously doubt the strong, positive, external evidence from the manuscript attributions themselves, their consistency, their universality, and so on, as well as the attestation of multiple early fathers for each of these authors' 2nd century attributions from geographical regions that are far flung around the Roman Empire? Again, the real question then is, why would anyone seriously doubt this? But the evidence is much stronger than it is for Arian's authorship of the Anabasis. And the question is, or rather the answer is going to come from Dr. Ehrman. We're going to listen to his answer to the question of sort of the traditional authorship. Were they eyewitnesses and things like this? And he's going to rapid fire go through them in a few minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll sort of analyze every point he made and look at that, kind of scrutinize it and look at it more closely.
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by eyewitnesses, possibly those apostles themselves.
Well, of course, that's been the traditional view for many, many centuries. The view came to be questioned in modern times after the Enlightenment, especially in the 19th century and then into more modern times, it's important to point out that the gospel writers never name themselves. The phrase according to Matthew or according to Mark can be found in titles of the book. But, nobody writes a book, calls their book, according to themselves. And when I'm writing a book now on the book of Revelation, and the title of the book will not be according to Bart. That's not the title of a book about Revelation. And so this is somebody, whoever put the title on there was telling you who, in their opinion, wrote the book. The books don't claim to be by eyewitnesses. They do not narrate their accounts in the first person. Their third person is about Jesus and his disciples were doing. The authors never identify themselves as one of the disciples. They're anonymous, written in the third person. The authors are all writing in Greek, fairly good Greek, not as good as like the highest level of the elites of the empire, but pretty good Greek, better than 99.9% of the population could write, which means these people were highly educated Greek-speaking Christians living outside of Palestine. Jesus' followers were all Jews living in Palestine who spoke Aramaic, and we have no indication that any of his close followers were educated. The two of his closest followers, Peter and John, are explicitly said to be illiterate in the book New Testament. Acts chapter 4, verse 13 says that they're agrammatoi, which means they don't know their letters. They don't know the alphabet. And so it's highly unlikely they're written by eyewitnesses. They don't claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They're written 30 to 60 years later by other people who had heard stories about Jesus in circulation that had been translated into Greek that they then wrote down and composed into Gospels. But I would say there's nothing to suggest that they were actually eyewitnesses, and they certainly don't claim to be.
So the first thing that Ehrman points out is the anonymity of the Gospels, that there aren't names. It's true, there are no names specifically mentioned, like the name Luke or Mark or John. He makes a point about according to, meaning that if you have a gospel title which says katamarkan, which means according to Mark, that clearly wouldn't be the initial title. Well, I think that's true. The title was the gospel according to. The earliest titles actually are the gospel according to, and then some of the later ones just use according to. And probably the term the gospel according to came from the beginning of Mark's gospel, which actually begins with the beginning of the gospel. That's the first words. So probably the title, as in terms of the gospel according to, comes later, but from the first verse of Mark. Again, it's no big deal one way or the other as far as I'm concerned. I'm not sure why he makes such a big deal of this. The names clearly aren't suppressed or hidden any more than they are with Arian or Xenophon or Livy or Sallust or Plutarch, other classical writers who don't include their names. There's nothing really a big deal about that. You can add a name, by the way, so you can use a flyleaf, you can use a superscription and so on. So there's ways to add the author's name to a publication that's not in the text. So we actually don't really know, since we don't have the first copies of these Gospels, we don't really know if a name was or wasn't attached. There were ways to attach a name. They may have had names attached to them. We just don't know. Or one or two of them did. The point is we don't know. It's an irrelevant point as far as I'm concerned, because it's perfectly conventional to not have the names of the authors in the text. He mentions that no authors claim to be eyewitnesses. Well, okay. Right. Mark doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. The earliest fathers say he definitely wasn't an eyewitness. And Luke absolutely tells the reader he wasn't an eyewitness. But in the case of John, it's the reverse. Obviously, the writer of John does claim to be an eyewitness, to be a disciple, the beloved disciple who wrote these things. And you can see my extended length commentary on why I think Ehrman is wrong in asserting this about John, and I go into that in quite detail and use classical writers to show, in addition to John's own book, to show why I think Ehrman is just flat out wrong on that, and I agree with other scholars who disagree with Ehrman as well. Ehrman goes on to say, authors don't narrate in the first person, but the third person in these Gospels. What's again not quite true of John. The last verse of John actually has the first person singular. So this it's not true of John, but it is true of the Synoptic Gospels. They write in the third person. And again, I guess I don't know how else to respond to this other than, so what? A ton of classical authors write in the third person. The greatest, most revered historian, Thucydides, writes in the third person of what's going on. So in his stories, as does Plutarch, this is the norm to write in third person. So I just don't understand. Again, sometimes you have to understand, for someone like me who's a classicist, more from that background, you hear Bible scholars say things, and I just don't understand why in their world this is such a big deal, because it wouldn't be any kind of big deal in the world that I come from. It just seems like it's making way, way too much out of it, and it sort of leaves the impression to me that they're just not used to reading the classical literature at large, but have just got a microscope on Bible stuff. I'm not saying that of Ehrman, you understand. Ehrman's a first-rate scholar. I'm saying that just in general, the impression I have sometimes when I hear things focused on in the biblical scholarly world. Authors don't identify themselves, Ehrman says, as one of the disciples. The authors don't identify themselves as one of the disciples. Well, that's not true of John, and I also don't think it's true of Matthew, because I think Matthew includes himself as a disciple in the narrative deliberately. So I think that's only true of Mark and Luke. So yes, that's true. Mark and Luke don't identify themselves as disciples. John, I think, indisputably does. All right, Ehrman's next point is that the Greek is good, but not very high quality compared to, the classical literature. I think that's the way he said it. I mean, I would probably say their Greek was competent. Some of it better than others. Luke is decent, is good. The others, I don't see any of them that I would just say is good. I would say it's competent. But no big deal, fine. It's in that range. It's certainly nothing like the level of what you see among the more highly educated Greek writers, okay? Ehrman, I think he says, is 99.9%, which again is a figure I'm not holding him to that exactly. He just means it's overwhelmingly, or it's extremely unlikely that people could write like this. So I'll disagree with that a little bit, but anyway, keep in mind, most of the books we have, they come from writers who were professional writers. They're literary men. They wrote multiple works, and they have a highly crafted literary artistry. They're writing as artists. So yes, most of the classical literature we have is going to be significantly above what we have in the Gospels, because no one thinks these evangelists were like professional writers where they're constantly writing books as a part of a phase of life they're in, like Arian, where he retired and then he wrote, or Cicero, who wrote his entire life and published his speeches and philosophy books and things like this. I mean, they're not like that. The evangelists are more or less one-off books, except for Luke, right? So when you come to the Gospel of Mark, I mean, no one's claiming Mark wrote a bunch of stuff. So his writing's not that good. It's competent, but it's not that good. The Gospel of Matthew we have is a little better, but it's still just kind of average or competent, I guess. It's nothing like the literary artistry of, Origen, even, who wrote a ton and was a sort of a professional writer. So you understand the difference. The Gospels are, again, save for Luke, they're sort of one-off. Now, John wrote a letter, maybe 2 or 3 letters, but they're very small letters, very small. And they also have the same basic style. There's nothing that impressive about them compared to sort of the epistolary literature that comes from the Greeks, or even something like the letter to the Hebrews. I thought I would take a few minutes and explain what the difference is with high-quality Greek, artistic Greek, literary Greek, versus something like you see in a gospel. And I think you'll be able to see this enough between these 3 samples of literature. Okay, the first is from Origen, who's a church father in the 3rd century A.D., and Origen writes in his commentary on John. He says, what kind then of mindset to us is necessary to have in order that and now this is, keep in mind, this is a very literal word order translation, in order that the in earthen of lowly language treasures laid up word, the by everyone happening to come upon it being read writing, I'll just stop there because it's so hard for you to follow it. But what you have to do is you have to connect the bold words here. So in order that the word, connect what's in bold here, the word, in order that the word, which is laid up in earthen treasures, notice earthen and treasures are they go together, the word which is laid up in earthen treasures of lowly language. The writing, connect the and writing, read by everyone happening to come upon it, the perceptible word, that is perceptible through sound, heard by everyone presenting their physical ears, to receive in a worthy manner we might be able. Okay? So this is a literal translation of what you see in Origen's Greek. And the only thing you really have to see is just how artistic it is, that he sort of sandwiches like the definite article the with his noun word, and then he creates a little what they call a chiasm, where it kind of folds in. The expression in earthen goes with treasures, and of lowly language is going with in earthen treasures of lowly language. By the way, he's talking about John's gospel, ironically here, and he's talking about how lowly the language is of John's gospel. And as he does it, he's writing this statement in a highly artistic way. Okay? So his writing is very artistic. John's is not. And you can see the balance here. The writing, the second phrase here, the writing which is read by everyone happening to come upon it. In other words, Origen means that anybody who comes upon John can read it, because it's just so basic. The Greek is so basic, grammatically, vocabulary-wise, anybody could read it. Okay? But again, the way in which he writes this is actually highly artistic. These two statements here, the writing which is read, the word which is heard. Okay? By anyone who just literally presents their ears can hear John being read. And the question is whether we receive it in a worthy manner. So that's Origen. Okay? You don't have to know everything other than to say that the way he orders the words is highly balanced, proportional, artistic. Ideas are juxtaposed, the written word versus the verbal word and things like that. And if I were to just read it literally left to right, it would be very hard to follow what he actually means in English just by looking at it literally. Now, if we go to Luke's opening statement, okay, we've already looked at it once, but let's look at it again. Now look at the exact word order. He says, since many have undertaken to compile an account of the fulfilled among us things, the things fulfilled among us, right? Just as they delivered to us, and now here comes the subject, the from the beginning observers and ministers having become of the word. And notice observers and ministers is balanced each by an expression, one before it, from the beginning, and the other after it, having become of the word. Okay? Ministers having become of the word. So all that is to say, again, it's a nice little proportioned statement here. It's sort of a mini chiasm. For those of you that don't know what a chiasm is, it's artistic. And then he says, it seemed good also to me. Again, this is the word order. Having investigated from the beginning all things accurately, in an orderly way to you to write, most excellent Theophilus, in order that you might come to know, concerning which you were taught, the account's reliability. So to know the account's reliability concerning which you were taught. So if I just read this from left to right, the literal word order, you would be able to see there's a little bit of artistry in it, but not nearly as much as you see in Origen. Origen is a much better writer than Luke, and is conveys better in the sense that it's more artistic. It's more driven by artistic complexity and balance and proportion and things like this than what you get in Luke. And you can tell just by reading it in a literal translation in English. But now look at John. Look at how short the sentences are and the phrases. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. This one was in the beginning with God. All things through him came into being, and without him came into being not one thing that has come into being. In him life was, and the life was the light of men, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it doesn't overtake. So notice here all the ands, and notice it's just short statements. Now granted, this is the opening. It's a little bit simpler than the rest of the gospel, but still my point is You can read this in English, literally in the word order of Greek, and it's not hard to follow at all. You go to Luke's opening, and it's significantly harder, but still more or less intelligible. It's got longer sentences. They're more complex. Definite articles are separated from their nouns, and they're wrapping around prepositional phrases and stuff to create a little artistry. And then with Origen, you get a much more complex kind of sentence structure, a word order structure, and so on. And also the vocabulary, by the way, that Origen uses is much more complex than anything you see in John. So all that is just to try and give you a little taste for what I mean when I say that John is pretty simple. In other words, these Gospels show that they are not written by high professional authors. They're the kind of product you expect from people who are not professional authors, who can write but don't have, aren't literary men in that sense. Now, the Gospels do have literary power, of course, but the literary power is not stylistic. It's in the theological depth and in the way in which they juxtapose stories. It's not as though there's no depth to the writing, but the depth is in the way in which the stories are theologized, right? The Gospel stories are unique in the sense that they're basically sermonized accounts of these events in Jesus' life. They're like little mini sermons. They have a theological bent or interpretation. They tell you what happened, but they always filter it through an interpretive theology, and then they're strung together in a what is I guess a variable macro structure that creates a gospel. It's loosely chronological. So the key is that these stories are sort of sermonized accounts, and the reason I say that is because they give evidence of being the products of people who have been preaching events, right? You have things that happened. Like I could say Barack Obama won the presidency, or Barack Obama was the president of the 3rd president of the United States. I think I'm right about that. But anyway, I could just say that as a fact, or I could describe the events of his getting elected. And I could do that very blandly, or I could say, look, Barack Obama being elected to the presidency of the United States is an extraordinary moment, and I could sort of dramatize it in the way I tell it, because he's the first African American has been elected to the presidency of the United States. So there could be a way to tell that would be emphasizing sort of the moment, what it means that America has had its first African American president, and so on. So when all that is just to say, these stories in the Gospels are not just accounts. They're looking at like the theology, and they're setting certain stories against one another because by juxtaposing them, it highlights certain theological lessons. So that's the kind of things we would expect from people who are preaching these stories as sermons and giving accounts of them and then applying them to teachings. And the way Papias said that Peter would tell the teachings of Jesus and apply them to the needs of the churches and things like this, of whatever the issues were. Let's just talk about literacy for a second. So just to give you a broad kind of take on what's going on with deciding like what the literacy rates, okay? There's two models you can use. There's what you call a theoretical model, all right, where you say, look, in order for there to be mass literacy, there have to be certain features that are a part of the culture. Like you have to have mass education. You have to have a government that has a self-interest in creating and promoting and funding mass education. You have to have teachers available who can teach, and the kind of economy that supports this. And if you don't have mass education, then you at least have to be able to have people who can afford private education. So that takes a certain amount of economics and so on to be able to have any kind of regular schooling. And if you don't have those features in the ancient culture, then there's no way to have had mass literacy. Literacy would have been way down in the 5% or less type framework. Based on maybe economic models, you could say it's a little higher, maybe 5 to 10% at the most in some places. Okay, and that's exactly what the biggest studies are that have been done, that are I should say the most famous studies and sort of the standard works, one by Harris in the classical world in general, but then also by Hezer, if that's how you say her name, in the Palestinian world, in the sort of the world of the apostles and Jesus and so on. And Ehrman refers to these studies regularly, which he should. They're great studies and they're standard works. But of course, there are now, I forgot to tell you, the other model. There's a theoretical model, okay, which those two people rely upon heavily, Harrison and Hezer. And then you also have primary sources, the evidence that comes from the actual literature and archaeology, what they tell us or reveal about the practices of reading and writing in the ancient world. And the Harris, his main work, which Hezer uses, then applies to a large period of Jewish history, Palestinian history. Those are theoretical models, okay? Like she doesn't even talk about, Hezer doesn't even talk, I think, about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a primary source evidence, okay? So people like Alan Millard, he wrote a book focused heavily on the primary source evidence. So the people who tend to focus on the primary source evidence tend to have a more optimistic view that literacy was higher rates. The people who use the theoretical models tend to have much lower rates. And I sort of think we should just take in both of those. Okay, that's the answer to me, is you should use both of them. And really, we're not going to have like a great conclusion. I mean, it's good that people have put out percentages, but we just do not have enough evidence to conclude strongly, confidently, what the real literacy rates were. Okay, we just don't. And it's good to use both these kinds of evidence. And I'm kind of more in the optimistic camp, but it's not really super relevant to what we're discussing here. The most recent study for Palestine that's of greatest relevance is done by Michael Wise Owen. He has the most recent research on literacy, and I think you have to go to him. And he does a really good job of critiquing the previous research and in explaining why he has much higher rates for Judea in particular, Jerusalem. The real issue, though, is that when we say literate versus illiterate, in our context, we mean either a person can read and write or they can't do either. That's the way we think of literacy and illiteracy. It's a black and white thing. You can read and write or you can't do either. But we know quite confidently that this is not probably the right category to look at literacy in the classical world. There were much greater gradations of literacy. There were the literary men, professional writers, very, very high-level writers. But there's also gradations. Some people knew enough that they could read the names of like bricks and vases, had identification information on where like a brick or a stone would be fit into a building. So a laborer had to know how to read that information in order to put it into the building, or how to organize when they were in the dockyards and they were shipping off wine or grain or something. They had to be able to read the small amounts of information on the amphora in order to know where to stack it. And obviously these are laborers, so you have information like that. You have signatures. We have a ton of information of people who could sign their names. Other people couldn't. Other people could sign it, but it was very slowly. They were called grafentos vradeos, grafondes vradeos, meaning slow writers. So we have, then of course, some people could write letters, very, very plain, basic grammar with mistakes. Other people could write books, so there's huge gradations of literacy in the ancient world. The theoretical models show that literacy was inferior, of course, to modern literacy. No surprise there. But the primary source material kind of pushes back against that and suggests that people could learn to write, people could learn to read. The incentives weren't quite the same they are today, but there was still incentives, and a lot of people had to have at least some basic ability to know their letters or numbers. Letters were numbers, by the way, in Greek. So all that is just to say you're either literate or you're illiterate is not accounting for the complexity of what literacy really was in the ancient world. I don't think the literacy rates are at all a good argument for deciding whether these people could have written the Gospels. I mean, Luke and Mark already suggested why I thought they had enough education they could at least read and write at some level. But again, did they still need an amanuensis or a scribe or a better writer to help them? We have no idea. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. With Matthew, he was a tax collector, so he had at least some basic writing ability. And again, we don't have access to his Hebrew, but maybe he had help. I don't know. Okay, so I don't find it very convincing anyway that literacy is going to be a very good way to refute all of the other evidence that points to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John writing these Gospels, okay? And here's why. First of all, who wrote Homer's Iliad? Who do you think wrote Homer's Iliad? Do you think it was Homer? I mean, in the classical world, everybody said Homer wrote Homer's Iliad, okay? Did you know Homer was blind? I mean, he's the blind bard. He's famously called the blind bard. A ton of authors refer to him as blind. So why would anybody think Homer could write the Iliad if he was blind? Why didn't people say, oh, well, he never could have written it. Obviously, he was illiterate. He couldn't read or write because he was blind. So he couldn't have written the Iliad. So nobody ever thought the Iliad could have been produced by Homer. And, what the answer is going to be is that that's a very stupid argument. Homer was a bard. Bards sung. So he had a voice. He wasn't mute. And he could produce the content that we have in the Iliad. And how did that content get written? Well, if he was blind, obviously he needed a scribe to write it down. Okay, fine. He used a scribe. But it's attributed to Homer, even though he's blind. He was obviously gifted verbally. He could produce the content out of his mouth, out of his mind, that was highly artistic and so on. But someone else had to have written it down if he was blind at the time it was written. But there's nothing controversial about that because they had scribes and so on, people who could write. All that is just to say that's an example of why I think it's sort of a weak argument. But let's go into it a little more. Let's take Lucian. Okay, Lucian is an Aramaic speaker from Syria, living just after the Apostolic Age. Okay, early 100s AD. He's a sculptor's helper. He's a laborer as a young man. Okay, he's a laborer. His family are laborers. That's the point. And guess what? He ends up being one of the greatest, or one of the more popular, influencing writers of Greek from the 2nd century AD. Okay, his Greek is quite good. Now he comments that his accent wasn't good in Greek, but he eventually became a literary man. In fact, it didn't take long. In his 20s and 30s, he was already producing literature. Okay, but he grew up in a laboring home I said in Syria, right? That means just north of Israel, just north of Palestine, from a small village. Now, if you use Ehrman's argument, you would say, well, Lucian couldn't have done that. The odds are so astronomically low, it's impossible that Lucian could have done that, because he's from a small village and he's a laborer and so on. So that couldn't have happened. But do you know how many scholars hold that view? I don't know any. Do you know how many scholars think that because of the low literacy rates, Lucian couldn't have ended up becoming the author that he became? I don't know anybody who argues that. So I don't think this is just a very good argument to refute all the other evidence. Let's just assume, by the way, that the literacy rates really were like 3%, 5%, whatever. That would mean that in a typical church, like in the church of, let's say the church in Ephesus, where John produced his gospel, let's assume there's only 100 people in the church. There's probably more, but let's assume there's 100 Christians in Ephesus. 100 people, some of whom for sure had some money. They weren't all just uneducated rubes. So what's the percentage then that there would be at least a couple of people, right? 3 to 5, who could write the gospel, whatever is in John's head. And then we have letters to Ephesus. There are 3 letters to the church of Ephesus that we know of. There's letters from the Smyrnians to the Philippians. We have writers who are exchanging letters in this very area where John wrote his gospel. Obviously, they still exchanged letters. They still had people who could write and read. So there were people there, that is to say, that if John wanted to write a gospel, it's not going to be difficult to produce it. So again, how it got put down, actually pen to paper, is not really that important, I don't think, to the traditional view, and therefore the arguments from literacy just aren't really that convincing, I think. Now, not a single early father, to my knowledge, or a critic of Christians. We have like Celsus, who wrote, we have a lot of his criticisms of the Gospels and the Jesus and so on. And I'm not aware of any of them that argue that it was implausible that the disciples produced Gospels. In fact, Origen, I just shared with you a little while ago, his comment that John's Greek is so plain, anybody who just happened upon the book could read it. And Eusebius tells us that he's quite surprised that there weren't more accounts written by the apostles and the 72 disciples that are mentioned in the gospel. Well, doesn't Eusebius know how low the literacy rates are in his day? This, again, I just find this a very weak defeater, because it has to keep in mind, this is just a refutational argument. It's a defeater argument. It has to defeat all of the other evidence in order for it to have any force. So another thing that Ehrman mentions is the Jesus disciples spoke Aramaic, and they weren't educated. Now, actually, the recent studies have shown that, including, by the way, Michael Wise Owen talks about this in his book on literacy. We know that Israel was trilingual. Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic were all spoken and used. There are letters by Jews during the Bar Kokhba revolt which are in Greek. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's Greek. Josephus says that in Judea, any slave could learn Greek if they wanted to. So we have synagogues in Jerusalem with Greek, like a Greek inscription dedicating the synagogue, even though it's in Jerusalem. So, and we know they spoke Hebrew. We have letters in Hebrew. They read Hebrew. They spoke in Hebrew. They taught Hebrew. And of course, we also know they spoke in Aramaic. So Israelite society was trilingual. Hardly just in Judea, but extends up into Galilee as well, almost certainly. There's no reason, I think, to doubt that, since they're socially, culturally, linguistically the same culture, the same people. He says, according to Acts chapter 4, verse 13, that they are agrammatos in Greek, meaning that you don't know your letters. That's how, they don't know the alphabet. That's how Ehrman characterizes it. So let's read it here. It says in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, now when they saw, they, by the way, are the leaders of the Sanhedrin, Pharisees and Sadducees and such. When they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated, that's our word agrammati, common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. The word uneducated is agrammatos, and the word common is idiotis, it's like our word idiot, but it doesn't mean idiot. It just means a private citizen, not a cultured public statesman. All right, so that's the actual line then from Luke that Ehrman is referring to, and Ehrman says agrammatos means they don't know their letters. Well, sometimes it means that, especially in what's called documentary literature, like papyri and stuff. If they say that someone can't sign their own name because they're agrammatos, it's because they literally don't know their letters. But in literature, like in normal literature, I would say most of the time agrammatos doesn't mean that you don't know your letters, your alphabet. It means your writing, your Greek is bad. In fact, there's places where it clearly means you're a bad writer. They use the word agrammatos as an adverb to mean you write Greek badly. It doesn't mean you can't write. It means you write badly. Your Greek isn't good because you're not educated. You're not formally schooled. If you look at the definition from Harris, William Harris, I remind you, that's the guy who did the work on literacy that Ehrman cites for his argument from literacy. He says it seems to veer between the meanings uncultured and incapable of reading and writing. Notice that. He says it veers between the meanings uncultured and incapable of reading and writing. Even the expression literas nescire, this is a Latin now expression, which is similar to agrammatos because it says you don't know your letters, which in English you would translate as not to know letters, may refer to lack of culture rather than to literacy in the narrow sense. When you're talking about literary literature, not documentary literature, agrammatos more commonly, if you look it up in Liddell and Scott's Greek, the standard Greek lexicon, if you look at the actual samples and go through and read the citations they give, I would say most often it's referring to people who are uncultured or uneducated. Sometimes it does mean they literally can't even read or write. Now, in Acts, it clearly doesn't mean that, because you have to rely on the context for exactly how to translate grammatos. Why do we know that probably it doesn't mean they just don't know their letters, they can't read or write at all? Because Peter and John aren't reading or writing. In the context, they've just been defending their beliefs about Jesus. They're not reading or writing, they're speaking. So when they respond that they're agrammati and idiote, it's most likely in the context that they're expressing surprise that these guys that have a thick Galilean accent are speaking with such confidence. Notice what it says. They were astonished. They recognized they had been with Jesus. They saw the boldness, the outspokenness. Parisia in Greek means outspokenness of Peter and John. In other words, Peter and John impressed them with their verbal confidence. They could argue their case in an impressive way, but not in a way that seemed like the way educated rabbis would make an argument or would speak. And it reminded them of Jesus, because Jesus wasn't schooled rabbinically, and yet he drew attention for his teaching. That's partly why he had so many crowds who came and listened to his teaching. And Peter and John, it was clear they had been with Jesus, and it reminded the Sanhedrin of the way Jesus communicated those that had actually heard Jesus teach in the temple when he visited for the festivals and so on. So all that is to say, the one place where Ehrman is citing that Peter and John are illiterate actually more likely means that they're simply not professionally schooled or educated. It doesn't really tell us whether they had any ability to read or write. We just have no idea. Okay, we can't say they did. We can't say they didn't. But it does emphasize in the very passage that these guys had a verbal confidence. They could make their case for defending their beliefs about Jesus in a way that impressed the educated members of the Sanhedrin. Peter and John went on to teach for years, for decades. They were public spokesmen. I mean, the word apostolos means a public it's a spokesman, a representative is what it is. They were the ones who were the original observers whom Jesus selected and appointed to be his spokespeople. And these spokesmen taught. Nobody doubts, right, that Peter was teaching the stories of Jesus, or John, Matthew and stuff. These apostles were teaching the accounts of Jesus' life and teaching the interpreting what he meant and things like this in churches for decades. Okay? So obviously their verbal abilities would have been decent after just not only does the passage Ehrman cite from Acts suggest clearly that they had impressive verbal abilities. Remember, we're kind of in the category of Homer, by the way. Homer was impressive verbally. Even if he was blind and couldn't put pen to paper, someone else could do that for him. If John and Peter were impressive verbally, then someone else could put the pen to paper if that's really all the problem is about whether they can actually write. Okay. Now, I would also suggest that they had high incentives to whatever degree they could read. They certainly would be incentivized to read better because of Jesus' constant references to Old Testament scriptures, his knowledge of the scriptures, and of course the early Christians were, the teachers of the Bible were teaching from the Old Testament. You would have a reading from the Hebrew scriptures, and then they would teach on it. And because there weren't New Testament, documents, of course, for these early decades. So they're relying on the Hebrew scriptures, whether they read them in Greek or in Hebrew or both. They're highly incentivized to go back to these scriptures and to have a mastery of them as the teachers. So now, does that prove that Peter and John, that they went back and learned to read if they hadn't known to read, they weren't able to read earlier, which, by the way, again, we don't know. I'm just saying they were highly incentivized to be able to read and read better. Now, again, I'm not proving that Peter and John could read and write. I don't have to. My point is that the refutation that Ehrman uses to try and show all the evidence suggesting Peter and John are behind say the letter of Peter or the teaching behind, I guess, Mark, because no one says Peter actually wrote Mark, but John writing the gospel. There's no real strong evidence that Peter and John couldn't read or write. There is strong evidence that they were not educated. They weren't cultured. Their teaching showed that. And indeed, John's gospel is not an impressive, I already showed you, it's a it's at best very competent basic Greek, and it's written 4 or 5 decades after the scene in Acts anyway. But John and Peter impressed people, the Sanhedrin, verbally in this very passage in Acts chapter 4. Now, this video just touches on, really, even though it's long, it's only touching on just a small amount of evidence that could be brought to bear on these questions. I just wanted to address Ehrman's particular critique and then also kind of lay out the traditional view and what stands behind that. There's lots of other questions that could come up. I'm just trying to sort of show you how I go about thinking about it, that we have this strong evidence externally for that that are witnesses to who actually wrote these 4 Gospels, that evidence is very early, it's very diverse geographically, that it's not the kind of evidence you would expect someone to invent, at least in the case of Mark and Luke. That the evidence of the manuscripts, that this is all overwhelming external evidence. In the classical world, I don't think there'd be any question, really, or debate that these guys are the actual authors behind it. The arguments to defeat it internally, both the content of the books, they match the kind of writing I think you would expect from Jewish Christians or Jewish Christian communities if they were Jewish Christian scribes actually penning it. That's not super literary. It's not super impressive except for Luke's. And the arguments against this, in this case, the argument from literacy, is not anywhere near a sufficient defeater of all this other positive evidence. So what do you think? Go back and look at the sources. If you want to comment here, just know that I will have assumed you're going to go and look at the sources that I referenced. If you're going to offer some critique, I'm going to hold you to that bar, that low bar at least. Look at the sources I referenced if you want me to reply. So best wishes.